The first ribbon tightened around my wrist before I understood that my life had already begun to slip into a shape I no longer recognized. It happened on a day that looked harmless, the kind of gray afternoon where nothing feels important enough to remember later, and yet when I replay it now, every sound is weight, every breath feels like a warning I ignored. I had come to the old house thinking I was doing a favor, thinking I was still the dependable version of myself, the man who showed up, who fixed things, who didn't ask too many questions. The place smelled faintly of dust and lavender polish, a contradiction that should have unsettled me more than it did. I remember standing in the entryway, coat still on, hearing my own footsteps echo as if the house was listening. They said it would be temporary. That word was offered gently, almost kindly, like a hand placed on my shoulder. Temporary adjustments. Temporary presentation. Temporary expectations. I told myself I could endure anything for a short while. I didn't realize that temporary was the first ribbon, thin and decorative, but strong enough to bind a future I hadn't agreed to. The mirror was what truly betrayed me. Not because it showed anything different yet, but because of how intently they watched my reflection instead of my face. Their eyes followed lines I'd never thought about. The slope of my shoulders, the way my hair fell when I leaned forward, the softness I had always dismissed as coincidence. Someone hummed softly behind me, tying something unseen, planning something precise. The sound threaded through my thoughts and made my chest tighten with a feeling I couldn't name. I tried to laugh. I made a joke. I said I didn't understand the point of all this pageantry. My voice sounded too loud, too sharp in that room. It didn't fit the atmosphere they were creating around me, an atmosphere that felt deliberate, curated, as if I were stepping into a story already written. They smiled at me the way people do when they are humoring a child who doesn't know the rules yet. "Just trust us," one of them said, and the word "us" landed harder than it should have. The first change wasn't clothing. It was posture. I was asked, no, guided, to sit differently, to stand differently, to hold my hands still instead of stuffing them into my pockets. Each correction felt small, almost polite, but together they formed a quiet choreography that my body began to follow before my mind could object. I became acutely aware of myself, of how much space I took up, of how often I had relied on casual sprawl as armor. Stripped of that, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. When the ribbons came out, soft fabric, pale colors, absurdly pretty, I finally protested. I said this wasn't me. I said I was uncomfortable. I said I didn't agree. They listened. That was the unsettling part. They listened patiently, nodded thoughtfully, and then proceeded as if my words were simply part of the process, expected resistance that would pass. The ribbon around my wrist was symbolic, they said. A reminder. It wasn't tight enough to hurt, but it was tight enough that I couldn't forget it was there. As they tied it, their fingers brushed my skin, and a strange heat rose to my face. Not attraction, not fear exactly, but the shock of being handled with intention. I wasn't invisible here. I was the focus. I caught my reflection again, just briefly. Same face. Same eyes. But there was something new hovering behind them, uncertainty mixed with a flicker of curiosity I didn't want to acknowledge. That frightened me more than the ribbon ever could. I had always believed I knew who I was because I knew who I wasn't. Now that boundary felt thinner, like paper held up to the light. They spoke about refinement, about learning, about becoming something gentler, more expressive, more honest. The words sounded flattering when strung together, but each one nudged me further from the self I had rehearsed my entire life. I told myself I was playing along to get through the day. I told myself this was performance, not transformation. Still, when they asked me to remove my coat, I hesitated. The coat had always been my shield. Heavy, practical, familiar. Sliding it off felt like surrendering evidence that I had arrived here as myself. The air touched my arms differently without it, cooler, more intimate. Someone draped something light over my shoulders in its place. Not yet feminine, not yet anything obvious, but undeniably not mine. The fabric whispered when I moved, a sound that seemed too loud in my ears. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I could still leave. The door was right there. Nothing was locked. No one was holding me. And yet my feet didn't move. Curiosity braided itself with fear, and together they held me in place more securely than any knot. As the afternoon stretched on, instructions layered themselves gently but relentlessly.
Sit. Stand.
Listen.
Repeat.
I felt myself being observed not as a person, but as a possibility. Each glance, each adjustment, felt like a brushstroke on a canvas I hadn't consented to become. And somewhere between resistance and compliance, something inside me went quiet, watching, waiting. By the time the sun dipped low enough to tint the windows gold, I realized with a jolt that this was only the beginning. Not because of what had already changed, but because of how quickly my objections were being rewritten into questions, and my questions into silence. The ribbon on my wrist caught the light, and for a moment, it looked less like a restraint and more like a promise. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't just being dressed or directed. I was being remade, one careful, ribbon step at a time, and a part of me, buried deep and trembling, was afraid of how much it wanted to see what came next. Sleep didn't erase the ribbon. It only taught me how to feel it even when it wasn't there. I woke the next morning disoriented, my mind clinging to the certainty that I was still myself, that yesterday had been an elaborate misunderstanding I could laugh about later. But the room around me refused to cooperate with that story. The light was softer than I expected, filtered through curtains I didn't remember approving, and the air carried that same quiet lavender note, now familiar enough to feel intentional. For a moment, I lay still, listening to my own breathing, measuring it, wondering when I had started doing that. When I sat up, my body moved cautiously, as if it had learned overnight that sudden gestures were no longer welcome. That realization unsettled me more than any instruction they had given. No one was watching me now. No voice corrected my posture. And yet I adjusted myself anyway, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, placing my feet carefully on the floor. Habit was already forming, delicate and dangerous. They greeted me as if nothing unusual had happened, as if this were the most natural continuation of a perfectly ordinary arrangement. There was warmth in their voices, approval even, and I hated how instinctively I leaned toward it. Approval had always mattered to me. I just hadn't noticed how much until it was being offered for things I'd never done before. They spoke about today as if it were a lesson, not a demand. A chance to explore, to understand. Words chosen to feel generous. I told myself again that I could leave after this. After today. After I proved something, though I couldn't have said what. The changes became more visible, but still carefully restrained, like a door opening a fraction at a time. Clothes were chosen for me, not dramatic or exaggerated, just subtly unfamiliar. Lighter fabrics. Softer lines. Nothing anyone on the street would point at, and somehow that made it worse. There was no costume to hide behind, no excuse to tell myself this was parody. When I caught my reflection, I didn't see someone pretending. I saw someone transitioning between definitions, suspended in a space with no clear name. My emotions didn't cooperate with my logic. I expected anger. I expected humiliation. Instead, I felt a strange pull of attentiveness, as if the world had suddenly asked me to listen more closely. Every sensation sharpened. The brush of fabric against my skin, the sound of my steps, the way people looked at me just a second longer than before. That extra second felt enormous, like a spotlight, and my heart raced every time it happened. They coached me gently through movements I'd never consciously practiced. How to sit without spreading, how to gesture without force, how to let pauses exist instead of filling them. Each correction landed like a small rebuke to the life I'd lived before. I wanted to argue that these things didn't define me, that none of this mattered. But the truth pressed back harder. I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I was present inside my body, aware of it as something expressive instead of purely functional. At one point, someone handed me a ribbon again. Not to tie this time, just to hold. Notice how it feels, they said, as if this were an exercise in mindfulness. The ribbon was cool, smooth, almost weightless. I rolled it between my fingers, surprised by how calming the repetition felt. My hands had always been tools, now they were being asked to experience. That was when the conflict sharpened. A voice inside me insisted this was wrong, that I was being guided somewhere without having agreed to the destination. Another voice, quieter, more honest, whispered that I had always wondered what it would feel like to stop resisting softness. That thought frightened me so much I almost dropped the ribbon. Later, alone again, I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary. I catalogued differences that others might not notice. The way my shoulders no longer squared automatically, the way my expression had learned to soften when resting. I practiced a smile and didn't recognize it. Not because it looked feminine, but because it looked unguarded. That realization made my throat tighten. I wasn't losing myself. That was the most dangerous part. I was discovering aspects of myself I'd never been given permission to acknowledge. And because no one had forced me to feel this way, because it was emerging on its own, it felt harder to reject. When evening came, they asked me how I felt. The question was simple, sincere. I opened my mouth ready to defend myself, ready to assert boundaries, ready to reclaim certainty. What came out instead was hesitation. Silence. Then a truth I hadn't rehearsed. "I don't know," I said. They smiled, not triumphantly, but patiently, as if that answer was exactly where the journey was meant to begin. As if not knowing was a doorway, not a failure. I went to sleep that night unsettled, aware that something inside me was rearranging itself without asking for permission, and afraid of how natural that felt. The ribbon lay folded on the table beside my bed. I didn't put it away. By the third day, the ribbon no longer felt like an object, it felt like a signal. I noticed it in the way my attention sharpened whenever someone entered the room, in the way my thoughts slowed before my body moved, as if I were constantly checking an invisible cue. I hadn't been given any new instructions that morning, and yet I followed an unspoken script with unsettling precision. The absence of direct guidance made everything feel more deliberate, more revealing. This wasn't obedience anymore. It was adaptation. They introduced the outside world carefully, like testing water with a fingertip. A short walk. Nothing dramatic. Nothing public enough to cause a scene. Still, the idea of stepping beyond the threshold sent a tremor through me that I couldn't disguise. Inside the house, everything felt curated, controlled. Outside, there would be variables, people who didn't know the rules, glances that weren't softened by intention. As I stood near the door, I caught my reflection in the glass panel. The image startled me, not because I looked like someone else, but because I looked like a version of myself that had been edited. Smoothed. Considered. My clothes didn't announce anything, but they suggested something. A quiet rebalancing of lines and choices. I realized with a jolt that if someone saw me now, they wouldn't see a transformation story. They would just see a person, ambiguous enough to invite interpretation. That terrified me. The walk itself was uneventful, which somehow made it monumental. Footsteps on pavement. Wind brushing my face. The ordinary sounds of life continuing without noticing my internal upheaval. Every passing stranger felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I became hyper-aware of my body, how I held my shoulders, how my arms moved, how my gaze met or avoided others. I wondered if anyone could tell how loudly my heart was pounding. No one stopped me. No one stared openly. A few looks lingered, curious rather than hostile. Each one sent a spike of adrenaline through me, followed by something else I wasn't prepared for. Relief. The world hadn't collapsed. I hadn't been exposed. Instead, I felt strangely visible in a way that wasn't dangerous. Just different. When we returned, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear alone, but from the release of tension. They noticed, of course. They always noticed. Someone handed me a glass of water, their gesture calm, grounding. "You did well," they said, and the approval landed heavier than it should have. I hated how much it steadied me. Later that afternoon, the conversation shifted. Not about what I was wearing or how I moved, but about who I thought I was. Questions were asked gently, without accusation. What parts of myself had I learned to hide? What expectations had I accepted without examination? I answered defensively at first, clinging to familiar narratives. But each answer felt thinner than the last, like a script that had been memorized long ago and no longer fit the circumstances. The most unsettling realization came quietly. I wasn't being erased. I was being examined. Turned slowly, like a stone in someone's palm, every surface studied for texture and truth. That kind of attention is intimate, even when it's not physical. It left me feeling exposed in ways I couldn't articulate. That evening, alone again, I found myself practicing the things they hadn't asked me to practice. Standing differently. Speaking softly to my reflection. Testing tones I'd never allowed myself to use. Each experiment sent a ripple of emotion through me. Shame, curiosity, something like relief. I stopped pretending this was all external. The changes were happening because part of me was responding, resonating, leaning in. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally admitted what I'd been avoiding. I didn't know who I would be if this continued. And beneath that fear was another, quieter one. I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The ribbon was back on my wrist that night, tied loosely, almost carelessly. It didn't feel like a restraint anymore. It felt like a reminder that something was unfolding, whether I resisted or not. I lay there listening to my own thoughts, realizing they were no longer arguing in absolutes. They were negotiating. And in that negotiation, the version of myself I had always defended so fiercely was no longer the only voice in the room. Would you like to continue to the next part? The day they changed my name, if only experimentally, I felt it land in my chest before it reached my ears. They didn't announce it or make a ceremony out of it. It slipped into conversation so naturally that for a second I wondered if I'd misheard. The sound was softer than my given name, shaped differently in the mouth, carrying a rhythm that made me lift my head instinctively. When I realized they were addressing me, a strange warmth rushed through me, followed immediately by panic. Names are anchors. They decide how the world calls you back when you drift too far. I didn't agree to that, I said, and my voice cracked in a way that embarrassed me. They apologized calmly, sincerely, and said it was only for now, only within these walls, only to see how it felt. That word again, temporary, wrapped in kindness. I told myself a name was just sound, just habit. And yet, when they used my old name afterward, it felt oddly blunt, like something dropped instead of placed. That was the day the mirror became both enemy and ally. I stood in front of it longer than ever before, studying not just how I looked, but how I reacted to what I saw. My expression softened more easily now. My eyes lingered on details I used to ignore. I wasn't searching for masculinity or femininity. I was searching for coherence, for some alignment between what I felt and what reflected back at me. They introduced small rituals, framed as grounding rather than control. Choosing clothes with intention. Taking time before speaking. Pausing to notice how emotions registered in my body. None of it felt overtly restrictive, and that subtlety made it more powerful. I began to anticipate these moments, to feel unsettled when they didn't happen. The structure was becoming internal. The outside world returned in small doses. A conversation with a stranger. A brief errand. Each interaction felt like walking a tightrope between identities, balancing expectations that shifted depending on who was looking. I became acutely aware of how differently people responded to me now. Voices gentler, assumptions quieter, space negotiated instead of claimed. It wasn't better or worse. It was revealing. One afternoon, someone laughed at something I said, not politely, not out of obligation, but genuinely. The sound startled me. I realized with a jolt that I had spoken without performing, without guarding. The laugh wasn't directed at a role I was playing. It was a response to something real. That moment stayed with me longer than any instruction. Resistance flared unexpectedly that night. I lay awake cataloging everything that felt wrong, everything that scared me. I mourned the simplicity of certainty, the comfort of knowing exactly how I was supposed to exist in the world. I worried about what I was becoming, about how easily I was adapting, about what that adaptability said about who I'd been before. And yet, when morning came, I didn't reach for my old habits. I reached for the new ones without thinking. The experimental name was used again over breakfast. I didn't correct it this time. I noticed how my body responded, how my shoulders relaxed instead of tensing, how my attention sharpened instead of retreating. That scared me more than rejection ever had. Acceptance, I was learning, can be destabilizing when you don't believe you're allowed to want it. Later, alone, I said the name out loud. Just once. It echoed softly in the room, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I felt something settle inside me. Not certainty, not peace, but a fragile alignment that suggested I was no longer fighting every current at once. The ribbon was gone that day. No explanation. No replacement. I noticed its absence immediately, a phantom sensation at my wrist. I realized then how deeply it had worked its way into my awareness, not as a symbol of force, but as a marker of attention. Without it, I had to decide for myself how present I wanted to be. I chose presence. That choice frightened me.
It also steadied me.
I was no longer just being guided or corrected. I was participating. And somewhere in that participation, the line between who I was and who I was becoming blurred into something I could no longer dismiss as temporary. Would you like to continue to the next part? I didn't notice when the effort stopped feeling like effort. That realization came to me sideways, in a moment too ordinary to announce itself properly. I was listening to someone speak, nodding along, responding without rehearsing my tone or monitoring my posture, when it struck me that I wasn't correcting myself anymore. My body had learned a new grammar, and it was speaking fluently, without asking permission. The thought should have alarmed me. Instead, it left me oddly calm. They began stepping back then, just enough for me to feel the space where their guidance had been. No constant feedback. No immediate approval. The quiet was intentional, I think. It forced me to hear myself more clearly. Without an audience, I had to confront which parts of this experience I was choosing, and which parts had simply carried me along. The answer was uncomfortable. The line between the two had dissolved. I ventured out alone for the first time, a simple errand, nothing that required courage on paper. But as I walked, I became aware of how differently I occupied the world now. I noticed faces instead of scanning past them. I adjusted my pace to the rhythm around me instead of pushing through it. When someone spoke to me, their assumptions didn't bruise against me the way they once would have. They simply passed, registering, rearranging. I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. That was when doubt returned, sharper for having been absent. Was this real, or was it conditioning? Had I been shaped so gently that I couldn't feel the pressure anymore? The questions crowded in, demanding certainty I couldn't provide. I wanted proof, some immutable sign that this wasn't just adaptation wearing the mask of authenticity. I didn't find proof. What I found was memory. I remembered moments from long before the house, before the ribbons, before the careful language, moments I dismissed as quirks or phases or private thoughts best left unexamined. The way certain roles had always felt like costumes. The way I'd envied ease in others without knowing what I was envying. These recollections didn't accuse me. They contextualized me. They suggested continuity where I'd assumed rupture. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again. But this time, I wasn't searching for discrepancies. I was looking for recognition. I met my own eyes and waited for the reflexive rejection, the instinct to distance myself from what I saw. It didn't come. Instead, I felt something quieter and more difficult to name. Familiarity. Not certainty. Familiarity. The experimental name surfaced in my thoughts without being summoned. I tried my old name afterward, said it softly, then said the new one again. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, internal, a shift in where the sound seemed to land. One echoed outward. The other settled inward. I sat with that distinction longer than I meant to. When I rejoined them later, they didn't comment on how I looked or how I moved. They asked me what I wanted next. The question startled me so deeply I had to ask them to repeat it. Wanting had never been part of the structure. Enduring, adapting, learning, those I understood. Wanting felt dangerously close to ownership. I don't know, I said, and this time the words didn't feel like a failure. They accepted the answer without pushing, and something in my chest loosened. I realized then that the most profound shift hadn't been external at all. I was no longer measuring myself exclusively against who I used to be. I was allowing space for who I might become without demanding a final draft. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I caught myself arranging small details with care, placing things neatly, choosing softness where I once would have chosen speed. These weren't instructions anymore. They were preferences. That distinction settled over me with a weight that felt both heavy and earned. I lay awake for a long time, aware that the story I'd been telling myself about being forced was no longer sufficient. Something else was emerging, something that didn't erase the pressure or the confusion, but reframed them. I wasn't just being remade. I was participating in the remake, consciously now, with open eyes. And that meant the next step wouldn't be about compliance or resistance. It would be about choice. Would you like to continue to the next part? Choice sounded powerful until I had to live inside it. Once the word had been spoken, once I had acknowledged that I was no longer simply being carried forward, it changed the weight of every moment. There was no relief in that realization, no triumphant clarity. Instead, there was responsibility. Every movement, every decision, every silence now belonged to me in a way it hadn't before. I could no longer hide behind circumstance. That frightened me more than the early days ever had. They noticed the shift immediately, not in how I looked or spoke, but in how I hesitated. When guidance had been constant, hesitation had felt like resistance. Now it felt like deliberation, and deliberation carried consequence. They didn't rush me. They didn't reassure me. They waited, and in that waiting I felt seen more clearly than ever. I was asked to decide something small, something that would have been assigned without comment weeks ago. What to wear that day? The question stopped me cold. I stood in front of options that all felt strangely honest. None of them exaggerated, none of them disguises. Choosing meant acknowledging preference, and preference meant admitting that this wasn't just an exercise anymore. My hands trembled as I reached for one. I half-expected regret to follow immediately, a rush of panic, some internal alarm insisting I had gone too far. It didn't come. What came instead was a quiet resolve, fragile but unmistakable. I had chosen this, and that knowledge steadied me. The outside world felt different after that, not safer, not easier, but clearer. Interactions carried a new texture. When people responded to me, I no longer wondered only what they saw, I wondered how I felt being seen that way. Sometimes the answer was discomfort. Sometimes it was relief. Sometimes it was both at once. Holding those contradictions without fleeing from them felt like a skill I was only beginning to learn. There was a moment that afternoon that nearly unraveled me. Someone addressed me without hesitation, without correction, using the version of me I was still learning to accept. It was casual, unremarkable, and that was what made it devastating. No explanation. No confusion. Just recognition. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to excuse myself, retreating to a quiet corner where I could breathe through the surge of emotion that followed. I wasn't ready for how much that would mean. When I returned, no one asked where I'd gone. They didn't need to. They watched me with an attentiveness that felt earned rather than imposed. I realized then that whatever this process had begun as, it had become something else entirely. Not a test. Not a correction. A witnessing. That evening, alone, I revisited my doubts with more honesty than before. I acknowledged the fear of permanence, the worry that choosing meant closing doors forever. But alongside that fear was another truth I could no longer ignore. Staying as I had been would have been a choice too, one made out of inertia rather than intention. I had mistaken familiarity for safety. Now I was learning the difference. I spoke my experimental name again, not as a question this time, but as a statement. It didn't feel complete. It didn't feel final. But it felt possible. Possibility, I was learning, is not loud. It doesn't demand certainty. It waits patiently for courage to catch up. As I lay down that night, I understood something that reshaped the entire journey behind me. The ribbons, the rules, the careful steps, they hadn't created the self. They had slowed me down enough to notice it,
To feel it forming.
to decide whether I would turn away once I saw it clearly. Sleep came gently, without argument. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't bracing for what tomorrow might take from me. I was wondering, quietly and earnestly, what I might choose to bring with me into it. Would you like to continue to the next part? The final ribbon was never tied around my wrist. I understood that the moment I woke up on the last morning in that house, when nothing felt anticipatory anymore. No tension humming under my skin, no sense of being guided toward a reveal. The air was the same, the light familiar, but my body moved with a calm certainty that hadn't been there before. I wasn't waiting to be told who I was today. I was already inhabiting it. That realization didn't arrive with triumph. It arrived with grief. I grieved the version of myself who had believed survival meant narrowing, who had confused rigidity with strength. I grieved the years spent performing a role so convincingly that I'd forgotten it was a performance at all. Letting go of that self wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying until your hands were empty. They didn't frame this moment as an ending. There were no speeches, no declarations. They simply treated me as someone who belonged, not because I had changed, but because I had decided to stay present with the change that had already happened. That distinction mattered. It told me this wasn't about approval or success. It was about alignment. I stepped outside alone one last time, not as a test, not as practice, but as myself. The world met me, without ceremony. People passed. Conversations happened. Nothing extraordinary occurred, and yet everything felt different. I was no longer scanning for permission or bracing for correction. I was responsive instead of reactive. That shift felt like adulthood in its truest sense, not knowing everything, but trusting myself to meet what came. At a window I paused, catching my reflection unexpectedly. For a brief second, the old reflex stirred, the urge to analyze, to categorize, to judge. It faded almost immediately. What replaced it wasn't pride or certainty, but recognition. Not of a finished product, but of continuity. I could see where I'd been and who I was now, and I could sense where I might go without needing to define it yet. When I returned, they asked me one final question, not about names or presentation or plans. They asked me if I felt remade. I thought carefully before answering. No, I said. I feel revealed. The truth of that settled into the room, solid and calm. I hadn't been overwritten. I hadn't been erased. I had been slowed, softened, and given space to listen, to myself most of all. The force I'd feared had turned out to be pressure applied in the right direction, not to break me, but to show me the shape I naturally took when I stopped resisting. When I left that house, I didn't take a ribbon with me. I didn't need one. What I carried was quieter and far more permanent, the ability to choose presence over armor, honesty over habit, possibility over fear. The world didn't look simpler afterward. If anything, it looked more complex. But I was no longer afraid of that complexity. I was part of it. I walk through my life differently now. Not announcing who I am, not hiding it either. Just moving forward with the knowledge that identity isn't something you defend once and for all. It's something you listen to again and again as it grows clearer in your hands. And if there's one truth I've learned above all others, it's this. Transformation doesn't always arrive as a force that changes you. Sometimes, it arrives as permission to finally stop pretending you were never changing at all. Would you like to revisit any part of the story or explore a continuation beyond this ending?